Ideas for the ASU Barrett Honors College and is an affiliated professor with the Institute of Human Origins, which we mentioned before is Dr. Donald Johansson's group. Though he has a PhD in evolutionary biology, he now largely researches the history of biology and teaches classes on Darwinism and creationism, which we were talking about over breakfast. This is very interesting. He's going to tell you about that. He is particularly interested in the parallels between 19th century anti-evolutionism and modern young earth creationism and intelligent design theory. And he's going to offer an examination of a number of the myths surrounding Darwin's life and work. For example, was Darwin an atheist? Did he recant on his deathbed, which is something that I think the creationists try to say all the time. Oh, no, he threw it all out. Did Marx, and I assume you mean Karl, not Groucho, dedicate Das Kapital to Darwin? Was he a poor student, a middling scientist, and worse philosopher? So we're going to learn all of these very interesting questions and answers to these questions and more. Let us welcome from ASU, Dr. John Lynch.
I'm an inveterate pacer, so I'm going to have to sit myself down. Okay. For a change. I actually want to say before I start something about the Darwin dinner, because you picked Red Lobster, which is, I probably need to put this up. Okay. You picked Red Lobster, which is actually an interesting choice. But not a lot of people know that Darwin, when he was at the University of Cambridge, was a member of what was known as the Glutton Club. And what they used to do was essentially eat roadkill. This is no joke. He ate, when he was a young man, and we're talking about when he's 19, 20-year-old here, he ate bear, he tried armadillo, you name it, he tried it. So I think you're sort of underachieving a little here. Okay. Coyote, yeah, perfect. Tastes like chicken. I hear it. Okay. And unfortunately as well, I thought I had a really snappy beginning to all of this, but Susan stole it on me. So that's the last time I'll show her my speaking notes. Two people, as you now know, who were destined to have a great effect on Western culture were born on the same day, continents apart. On February 11th, 1809, Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln both would forever alter the intellectual and political climate not only of this country but of the world. And incidentally, both of them were abolitionists. Around both would grow a mythology, both from supporters and opponents, and within the popular imagination it's often very often very difficult to distinguish truth from fiction. I'm very happy to be here just a mere 8 days before Darwin Day, although, as I said to Bruce, perhaps we should also have Galileo Day at some stage. And I'm very happy to be given this opportunity to talk to you about some of those myths. Specifically, I'd like to talk about how opponents to Darwinism have refigured both Darwin's life and his ideas in a manner to make him and associate him with things that the majority of the American public appears to find unsavory. So with that in mind, I'm going to leave Lincoln to somebody else. You can have the next speaker to do myths about Lincoln. And of course, I'm not talking about the myth of Darwinism. Okay? I'm an evolutionary biologist. I don't think there is a myth of Darwinism, but there are, of course, myths about Darwinism. And specifically, as Susan alluded to, I want to talk about a couple of things. The first one is that, well, Darwin wasn't a very original thinker. He stole his ideas off a number of people, Alfred Russel Wallace being one of them. Secondly, the idea that natural selection was very quickly accepted after 1859. Everybody, in effect, went around slapping their heads, saying, my God, why didn't I think of this? Thirdly, I'm Irish, so my TH has come out kind of interesting. Thirdly, on his deathbed, Darwin, as Susan nicely put it, well said, that's it, I didn't believe anyway. And he recanted not only his ideas, but accepted Christianity. Next, the idea that both Marx and everybody's favorite crazy German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche were strident supporters of Darwin, as were the American social Darwinists, who glorified capitalistic excess, probably in a manner not seen since George W. Bush. And then lastly, the major claim that Darwinism itself is responsible for something called the death of culture, end quote. Okay? Now, advocates of these views, whether they are secular or religious, popular or intellectual, share one thing in common. They all believe that there's a cultural war ongoing in this country. The most extreme form of this view is manifested in the creationist belief that Darwinism itself is a product of Satan, and that it is indeed the main weapon in what Henry Morris of the Institute for Creation Research calls the long war on God. Now, before I start to get mythological on you, what I want to do is clarify some issues. We need to be clear in our minds the difference between evolution and Darwinism. Now, the philosopher of science Michael Ruse gives us three meanings for the word evolution. The first is the fact that we observe that things change over time. That's also known as descent with modification. Secondly, the path that these changes take. Archaeopteryx, birds, reptiles, all that sort of thing. And then lastly, the mechanism by which this happens. So we have fact, path, and mechanism. And Darwinism is just one possible mechanism. It is unguided, it is gradual, it is descent with modification, and it is by means of natural selection. Note that even if Darwinism was disproved tomorrow, I know, can you imagine it? But even if Darwinism was disproved tomorrow, it would not in any way remove any support for the phenomenon of evolution, okay, which is a fact most opponents of Darwinism don't realize. They think by removing Darwinism from the big picture, they immediately disprove evolution. And we all know what they think they do prove. Anyway, with that out of the way, I'm going to start off with my myths, as it were. I'm going to initially start talking about some myths that are held by creationists, and by this I mean believers in six-day literal biblical creation. We're all familiar with them. Secondly, I want to move on to distortions that are held by non-creationists, people who may indeed be non-religious, but usually are socially conservative. And lastly, I want to briefly consider more, quote-unquote, modern critiques of Darwin and Darwinian thinking. Let's start with Marx. Why not? Karl, rather than Chico or Groucho. It's fair to say that Darwin, Marx, and Freud, the triad who are often seen as leading the zeitgeist of the 20th century, have all received their fair share of criticism. Some people argue that they swept their brush too broadly over the canvas of human experience, and in so doing yielding to generalizations without considering particulars. Other people just imagine they're plain wrong. In predicting the demise of Darwinism, the mathematician David Berlinski would state that, and I quote, "Darwin's theory of evolution is the last of the great 19th century mystery religions. And as we speak, it is now following Freudianism and Marxism into the nether regions. And I am quite sure that Freud, Marx, and Darwin are commiserating with each other in the dark dungeon where discarded gods gather." Wonderful stuff. But his rhetoric aside, the three still remain important intellectual figures, discarded gods though they may be perceived to be. Indeed, Darwin and Marx remain entwined together in the popular imagination, and also in the academic imagination. Take, for example, Jacques Barzoon's book, Darwin, Marx, and Wagner, in which Barzoon blames, the flowering of materialism for everything that went wrong in the 20th century. And materialism he blames on Darwin. Henry Morris, creationist, informs us that, quote, "It is well known that not only the early communists, such as Marx and Engels, were atheistic evolutionists, but also that all the leaders of communism since have been the same. Marxism, socialism, and communism, no less than Nazism, are squarely based on evolutionism. Marx felt his own work to be the exact parallel of Darwin's. He even wished to dedicate a portion of Das Kapital to the author of The Origin of Species." Now, this idea is fairly common. If you go to any creationist presentation, and I use the word presentation very vaguely here, you will hear this story. It's on videos that are given out by the Institute for Creation Research. But is it true? Was Marx a Darwinist? Well, historians have effectively refuted this idea. The myth of the link between Darwin and Marx actually comes from Friedrich Engels, who in his graveside oration said, essentially, that Marx and Darwin were together. And it was picked up by later Marxists, such as Filippo Turati and Edward Aveling, in an effort to give scientific gloss to their worldview. In a sense, everybody realized that Darwinism was science, even in the late 1800s, so by adopting Darwinism and wedding it to Marxism, you suddenly say, hey, and Marxism is scientific as well. Fair enough. Now, what is we do also know is that there is apparently a letter from Darwin to Marx asking Marx not to dedicate Das Kapital to Darwin. As it turns out, this letter wasn't written to Marx. It was written to Edward Aveling, who actually was Marx's son-in-law. And Aveling was writing a book called A Student's Darwin, which was published in 1881. And it was vehemently anti-Christian. And Darwin didn't want his name associated with that. Okay? To him, that would get him into radical territory, and he wasn't willing to go there. Okay? So even the evidence of the letter that appears to be saying, listen, Carl, me old man, don't dedicate Das Kapital to me, turns out to be spurious. And we've known this for quite a long time. And actually, we also know something else interesting about Darwin. He couldn't read German very well. He was English. Very few English people did read German very well in those days. In fact, Thomas Henry Huxley was one of the few people who could read German, scientific German at that. And Marx did indeed give Darwin a copy of the second German edition of the first volume of Das Kapital. And you can see it today if you go to Down House in Kent, which is where Darwin died. And if you look, you'll notice an interesting thing. The pages of the book are uncut. Well, okay, the first 100 pages are cut, but for those of you who've seen the first volume of Das Kapital, it's over 800 pages long. Darwin tried, but couldn't get very far into this. Okay? So Darwin and Marx aren't really that close to each other. But is it possible that Marx is influenced by Darwin? Well, the answer again is no. While originally he came out and said that The Origin of Species contained, quote, the natural historical basis of our outlook, he eventually came to the viewpoint that Darwinism was nothing more than a bourgeoisie manifestation of the capitalistic excess of British culture. He was not a Darwinist. Okay? And in fact, he only refers to Darwin in two places. This is in Das Kapital, it's in the footnotes, and both of these references are negative. We have no other reference in letters, diaries, private correspondence, you name it, of Marx talking about Darwin. And what's more, to make the story even more ridiculous, any one of the young Marxists, if we can use that phrase, who tried to associate Marx with Darwin got quite quickly slapped across the back of the head. Okay? Buchner tried to do this, Friedrich Lang tried to do this, and Marx called essentially both of them idiots. Okay? So Marx clearly wasn't a Darwinist, and clearly he wasn't affected by Darwin. And this is really for one big reason. You see, Marx felt that whatever Darwin had to say about the natural world, that he had nothing to say about human history. For Marx, humankind lay outside, at least as far as its social development is concerned, lay outside of nature. He could not see what Darwin saw, that Darwinian theory could explain the totality of things, so he could never be a Darwinian. Now, there's a clear thing going on here. It's not very popular in this country to be a Marxist. I think that's probably an understatement. And we won't even talk about the communists. This idea of sort of attaching Darwin to what some people would see as being unsavory political and social theories is what Morse Peckham calls Darwinisticism. Okay? And let's be honest about this. Since 1859, Darwinism has been used to argue for cooperation, conflict, war, peace, eugenics, lack of eugenics, socialism, anarchism, social conservatism, You can use it to argue for anything if you really try hard enough. And I've got many students who do. Usually when they're failing the course, but that's a different thing. But we have to realize something very simple. Both Darwin's Descent of Man, for example, and the Bible have been used to argue for racism, anti-Semitism, white supremacy. And the key to it is this. It's the sheer power of these works, whether we're talking about Genesis, whether we're talking about the Bible, whether we're talking about the descent of man or origin. It's the sheer power of these works that allows them to be so intellectually malleable, which in some ways some people would argue is the sign of a great idea. George Bernard Shaw once said, he's Irish so I have to bring him up, George Bernard Shaw once said that Darwin had the luck to please anybody who had an axe to grind. Everybody became a Darwinist because that gives a sort of scientific veneer to what you want to say. Okay? Now, we obviously must differentiate from what we see in the biological world and the lessons we want to take from that. Okay? The non-biological lessons. Okay? Despite assertions to the contrary, just because we are related to non-human animals, this in no way gives us a blueprint to live our lives. And I'll get back to that later. Okay. Now, Marx, fair enough. It obviously does not surprise anybody who's done a bit of reading in this area that we can also try and ally Darwin with Hitler and Stalin. We might as well get the trifecta. Such alignment, even if it was true, even if Hitler was influenced by Darwin, in no way disproves evolution or natural selection. In no meaningful way can it, logically. Okay? It's simply a rhetorical position aimed at providing emotional support for a usually weak statement. Okay? Associate Darwin with the bad guys, therefore Darwin's a bad guy, therefore Darwin's wrong. Boom, boom. Philosophy 101, you fail straight away. Okay? But in this light, it's interesting to actually look at the words of one Walt Brown, who many of you may know is the director of the Center for Scientific Creationism here in Phoenix. Brown, speaking at a public event, said, and I quote, "Isms are generally bad. Communism, fascism, racism, scientism, secular humanism. If you want to bias somebody against any idea, put an ism at the end of it. Isms may be right or wrong, but they are always beliefs." Fair enough. But note that, yes, somebody pointed out creationism, and actually he later goes on and says we shouldn't use the word creationism. But of course all the other creationists do, so take it for what you will. But note that obviously harmful views, such as fascism and racism, are being coupled with ideas like humanism, which, I know I'm preaching to a choir here, is obviously a little less grey than fascism and racism, I hope. Otherwise I'm leaving now. But under Brown's strategy, creationist use of the phrase evolutionism makes perfect sense. If you read creationist material, they always refer to evolutionism. You talk to Eugenie Scott or any biologist, and they never use the word evolutionism. Okay. The point about isms is probably fairly true. We tend to look at something that's an ism just a little bit more, iffy. However, the status of things like pacifism, Catholicism, and Judaism, to name but three others, are obviously problematic within this framework, particularly if you happen to be Catholic, Jewish, or a pacifist. Okay. But another well-known ism that gets thrown around a lot is social Darwinism. Okay. We're often told that the likes of J.D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie pursued the Darwinian ideal ruthlessly and used it to justify their essentially rapine capitalistic practices. But it's now been shown that social Darwinists were only nominally Darwinists. They too were adopting the name of Darwin without adopting the content of Darwin's ideas. And in fact, that they were more influenced by Herbert Spencer, the English sociologist. Okay. I'll give you a quote from Robert Bannister, who's a historian of social thought. "Gilded Age defenders of free market mechanisms, individualism and laissez-faire, rarely lace their prose with appeals to Darwinism, and virtually never in the way described in conventional accounts. Rather, they were suspicious of, if not downright frightened by, the implications of the new theory." What we call social Darwinism, whatever that phrase may mean, was very much popular in British thought before Darwin even wrote The Origin of Species. And it's actually true to say he was influenced by social Darwinism. And it's ironic that the movement then adopts his name. By social Darwinism there I mean things like Malthusian population dynamics and the idea of poor laws and all that sort of stuff. Some of you may be familiar with. Okay? In other words, Darwin was a social Darwinist. And as the historian of biology, James Moore, points out, Darwinism has always been social, by very definition, because the political theories of the time did influence Darwin. Okay, another ism. Let's get them all out of the way while we're at it. Nazism, another great perennial favorite among our creationist friends. In its most simplistic view, this holds that Hitler had a direct debt to Darwin, and that we can see this debt by looking at Mein Kampf. Now, we should, of course, not ignore the Christian strand that runs through Mein Kampf and the general messianic character of Nazism in general. But a more sophisticated view of this says that Hitler's debt was in fact to Friedrich Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's debt was to Darwin. So the claim has been made that Nietzsche was a Darwinist. Okay. Now, Henry Morris, for example, tells us that Nietzsche was, quote, greatly influenced by Darwin, though he thought Darwin didn't go far enough in promoting the militaristic and racist implications of his theory. Now, Morris isn't the only one to think this. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who also was a Nazi, but we'll leave that alone, also adopted this viewpoint. Okay. But here's where things get interesting. Heidegger might in fact be a philosopher, but he doesn't know his Nietzsche. Because if you read Nietzsche, you actually see there was a marked antipathy for the German philosopher and the ideas of Darwin. In fact, he at one stage berated the, quote, scholarly oxen who have suspected me of Darwinism. I love that phrase, scholarly oxen. I want to use it in class, but it would get me sort of kicked out. Actually, if there are any scholarly oxen in this tale, it's the people I'm going to be talking about. Anyway, Nietzsche attacked Darwinism on two fronts. The first one is he didn't think that Darwin's theory of natural selection could actually do what Darwin said it could. And secondly, and in some ways more importantly, Nietzsche was worried about the use that Darwinism was being put by social radicals in Germany at the time. And we're talking about the late 1800s here. 1900, Nietzsche goes completely cuckoo and the rest is history. He clearly opposed Darwin's twin theories, natural selection and sexual selection. At one stage, he disproved sexual selection in his writings by turning around and saying, look, and this is commonplace experience to very many people, look, how come all the good-looking women end up with the short, ugly guys? If sexual selection was true, that shouldn't happen, right? At least in Nietzsche's mind. Nietzsche, by the way, was a short, ugly guy, but he's speaking for all the short, ugly guys out there. But in Will to Power, he explicitly states that he can't believe that natural selection could do what Darwin wanted it to do. He says, quote, against Darwinism, for most of the time during which a property is forming, it does not preserve the individual and is of no use to him, least of all in the struggle with external circumstances and enemies. Now, if you sort of break that down, what you'll actually see is the common creationist complaint. What good is half a wing? We've probably all heard it. And I'm not going to rehearse the standard Darwinistic, or Darwinian, should I say, answer to that. Read some Stephen Jay Gould, for example. But Nietzsche clearly felt that Darwin's selective mechanism could not do what he wanted it to do. And that, more importantly, that Darwin's ideas opposed his own theory of will to power. Okay? Because when Nietzsche looked around him, and this is the famous idea in Nietzsche's thought, when he looked around it, instead of seeing improvement via selection, he saw deterioration and decay. Society for Nietzsche was like a salmon, a tired, spent salmon that had just swum upstream, had spawned, and now was dying. Bringing us back to the Darwin fish and lobster. It all comes around. Anyway, society, to Nietzsche, had spent 2,000 years deteriorating. And obviously the 2,000 years are related to Christianity. Okay? He wrote, "I see on top and surviving everywhere those who compromise life and the value of life. The error of the school of Darwin becomes a problem to me. How can he be so blind to see so badly at this point?" Clearly not a Darwinist, right? In Twilight of the Idols, he would say, "The species does not grow to perfection. The weak prevail over the strong again and again. For they are the great majority, and they are also more intelligent." Nietzsche's using a slightly complicated idea of intelligence, obviously. But here's the thing. According to Nietzsche, or at least according to Nietzsche's reading of Darwin, it would be impossible for the weak to triumph. Because after all, Darwinism is the survival of the fittest. Who are the fittest? The strong survive, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Nietzsche clearly is not a Darwinist. Okay, that's enough of these isms. Okay? There are multitudinous other isms we could pick on. We're not going to do it. Because this association, the isms, if you want to look at it, is also backed up with another theory, or another strategy that's used by opponents of Darwinism. And that is to attack Darwin himself. You've kind of showed he's an unsavory character because all the Nazis liked him. So let's just hammer the nail home and just show he was a completely despicable character himself and probably ate babies, but we can't prove it. The Glutton Club, by the way, did not eat babies. For example, let's take an example of this. We'll take Henry Morris yet again. And I just want to say a quick thing about Henry Morris. I don't want to be doing, or seeming to be doing, what Huxley called twice slaying the slain. Okay? Picking on Henry Morris is like, kicking somebody when they're down intellectually. However, the thing about this is that the ideas, the myths that are being quoted here, are not only being used by young Earth creationists, but also some supposedly more sophisticated thinkers. And when we look at more modern movements like intelligent design, creationism, you see these same myths appearing again and again. Okay, so I'm using Morris as a representative. I'm not just trying to crucify him for the fun of it, although it is fun. Morris tells us about Darwin. He was not the brilliant scientist he is portrayed to be, and his discoveries were not original to him anyhow. The only college degree he ever earned was in theology, not biology, and he did poorly in that. He was a pampered time waster in college, and most of his contributions to experimental or observational science were quite mundane. His theories were not original, and he consistently failed to give credit to his predecessors. Well, we might as well leave now then, eh? Cancelled dinner. He's a shallow individual who did nothing of interest. Clearly, Morris has little respect for Darwin. And I'm also not suggesting here that what we need to do is go around whitewashing Darwin. Darwin was a gentleman of his time. He carried all the prejudices that Victorian, well-to-do males had. He was, at least in our modern viewpoint, a racist, although a very modified racist in various ways, and perhaps we can talk about that at question time. Okay? So, attempts to drag Darwin down are as bad as attempts to turn him into a patron saint of some sort. Okay? He was a human being. He was not the Son of God. I think. Now, just to reiterate a point, even if Darwin turned out to be the Antichrist, which I think Morris thinks he was, even if Darwin's work was completely derivative, even if he was a mediocre scientist, even if he was a serial plagiarist, that does not disprove evolution. It doesn't disprove natural selection as a mechanism. It just means that perhaps we should think about not having a Darwin Day and wearing birthday hats. Okay? That's Russell Day. Yeah, well, we could have Alfred Russel Wallace Day, or my particular favorite, Robert Chambers. But truth be told, Darwin was indeed a gentleman of leisure. He couldn't hack it in medical school at Edinburgh, so his father had to decide what to do with him. So his father says, well, you know what I'm going to do? Last vestige of a scoundrel, I'm turning him into a clergyman. Some truths are eternal. His father was well-to-do. He was a popular doctor. He was an astute businessman. And he sent his son down to Cambridge to do one of the 3 available degrees. And this is an important point. When you were in Cambridge, you could only do 3 things. Either theology, mathematics, or classics. No science, no biology, no astrophysics, nothing. And the reason why was very simple. There were no professional scientists in 1820. In fact, the word scientist itself wasn't coined until the early 1840s by the philosopher William Whewell. Okay? If you attended science classes or lectures at Cambridge, it was completely, if you felt like turning up. You paid for it. It was for your own edification. But you were not examined. You weren't asked any questions. You didn't have to do it. It was impossible to get a degree in biology. So clearly we can't hold this against Darwin. Okay? I went to a school which didn't have a degree in horticulture. Whoa, that stops me talking about plants for the rest of my life. Clearly illogical. Anyway, here's the important thing. Darwin came 10th in his class, and his class was the general class, not the honors class. And most people didn't go for the honors curriculum. The ones who did were the ones who were really serious about becoming clergymen, the likes of Adam Sedgwick, for example. So Darwin graduated 10th in, if I can remember correctly, a class of about 130, which quite frankly, between you, me, and the wall, and don't tell my employers at ASU, that's better than I ever did in school. Okay? So there we have it. Darwin's academic experiences are exactly what we would expect from a gentleman of leisure at that time. He's no worse a student than me, I guess, except I didn't have the money. Okay. It's equally easy to remove the claim that Darwin's work wasn't good. Okay? If I could just remind you of the quote from Morris, he said, most of his contributions to experimental or observational science were quite mundane. His theories were not original. Well, we can disprove this in a very unexpected way. We must remember an interesting thing that most people forget about Darwin. When he came home from the voyage on the Beagle, he was not a biologist. And parenthetically, he actually wasn't an evolutionist either. Okay? That's a whole different story that we don't have time to go into. But he was not a biologist. And in the first 6 or 7 years of his time, when he was living in London, he was a geologist. That is what he made his name as. He became secretary of the Geological Society of London, for example. Okay? And the fieldwork that he had done in South America and in the Pacific really set the stage for him. It made him a player, to use the modern word. Okay? It made him important. And one of the things that did it was his theory of how coral reefs got formed. Now, it seems obvious to us. It's all those little coral thingies, isn't it? Okay? Well, they did know that, but they were trying to explain the different shapes of coral reefs. Okay? Why you get atolls and why you get mountains and all this sort of stuff. And nobody really figured it out. And what Darwin did was take Lyell's idea of uniformitarianism, slow, gradual processes that we can see today constantly at work over time, and apply that to coral reefs. And it still is the theory we use today to explain the diversity of shapes of coral reefs. And many historians of biology and geology and science in general have pointed out that even if Darwin had died in 1840, he would be remembered as a first-class scientist and theorist today for the coral reef theory alone. Okay? So we shouldn't let evolution just cloud the issue. And it's another thing worth mentioning that Darwin was in fact a very good experimentalist. He had his son, he had this theory that earthworms were a little bit smarter than they were letting on. Which might be true for all we know, they just haven't told us. But part of this theory is he thought that if you play music to earthworms, they would respond. And he had his son play his, I think, oboe, can't remember the exact instrument. And to cut a long story short, the worms weren't exactly square dancing around on the table. Okay? And actually, I'll digress just a little bit. This was because he figured out that earthworms could figure out the most efficient way to pull a leaf into the hole. And he did this by a wonderful little experiment. He cut out pieces of paper in various shapes, for example, triangles. And he figured out, and then he put them down and watched the earthworms pull them in. And he figured out that the earthworms somehow always knew which the sharp end of the triangle is, because that's the most efficient end to grab and pull the thing. Who'd have thought it? Wonderful little experiment. And he tried different shapes, and he found out that no matter what the shape is, somehow the earthworms knew more than they were telling us. Okay. Anyway, so stuff like that makes it fairly clear that Darwin was in fact quite a talented experimentalist. And those of you who ever make it to Kent, to Down House, and I encourage you all to do it, had a wonderful summer this past summer taking students to England to see a lot of the Darwinian sites. But you can go into his house and you can see some of his experimental setups. Really fascinating stuff. The other thing I want to do actually just really quickly is also point out that we can very easily also disprove the idea that Darwin wasn't a very good student. You see, remember I said he went to Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh, for medical school and then dropped out of that. That is the only time he took a formal class in geology. He hated it. He hated it much the same way as I hated math. Okay? But he had 2 weeks of exposure in the field with Adam Sedgwick just before he went on the voyage to Beagle. He entirely taught himself as he was going around in his 5-year trip. And he comes back and he's publishing good scientific papers. Now, if that's a definition of a bad student, I have, unfortunately, not very many bad students in my classes. Okay. Let's move back again really quickly. The claim that Darwin stole his idea. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace is one example, and I'll talk about him in a second. But you sometimes hear that a couple of other individuals had stumbled across the idea of natural selection. Edward Blythe being an example. Blythe, by the way, was a creationist. And that Darwin had read their theories and then just passed them off as his own. Well, it is true. 3 individuals did indeed have a theory of natural selection. All 3 individuals were anti-evolutionists. All 3 of them published in some fairly obscure places. For example, Blythe's theory was published in the back of a book about how the Royal Navy uses timber. Okay? Not the sort of thing Darwin was going to be picking up on any given day. Okay? But more importantly, their view of natural selection was completely different from Darwin's. To them, natural selection was a purely negative force. It just removed the, excuse me for using the word, the weak. It culled the crop, as it were. Okay? And in fact, they use the fact that natural selection is going on to argue that evolution, if it happened, required God. Because a negative force could not, in their mind, lead to design, could not lead to innovation. Okay. Now, if indeed Darwin took the idea, it could happen from these guys, he put a completely different spin on it. Because the beauty of Darwin's idea is that you can now explain design without requiring a designer. Okay. Now, but even if, let me rephrase that in a different way actually, even if he was not the originator of the idea, he's the first person to put together a cogent system of thought based on it. Okay? A cogent system of thought that does what William Whewell calls providing a consilience of inductions. It predicts different things outside of its sphere. That's the beauty of Darwinism, the fact that you can explain so many things. Okay? And more importantly, even if he was in this situation, even if he stole the idea, or even if he wasn't the first, even if he just stumbled across it, or even if he invented it himself but he wasn't the first person, whatever permutation of that we want to find ourselves in, he would have been analogous to Copernicus. Because Copernicus, of course, wasn't the first person that accepted heliocentricity, the idea that the sun's at the center of the solar system. Okay? So if we're going to drag down Darwin in this point, we might as well take down Copernicus. And we'll be taking down quite a lot of people fairly quickly. Teaching history of science will become a lot easier. Now, let's get a quick drop of water. It's actually vodka. It's noon somewhere in the world. Okay, at this juncture, I'm going to hit the two big myths about Darwinism. The first one is the claim, based on the testimony of a woman by the name of Elizabeth Cotton, who's also known as Lady Hope, that Darwin, on his deathbed, reconverted to Christianity and essentially made a speech along the lines of, the book, I don't know why I ever went against the book, and gave her permission to hold a tent revival on the grounds of Down House. I hear this every single year that I teach Darwinism. Some kid always comes up to me and goes, but isn't it true that he recanted? And I point off as a starter that even if he did recant, what does that tell us? Zero. Nothing. Nada. Because that doesn't say, just because Darwin suddenly went, oh, maybe I was wrong. Or, my God, I think I'm going to fry. I better save my soul, whatever that may be. Even if he did that, out of fear or whatever, that doesn't disprove natural selection. Over 150 years of empirical evidence are telling us that natural selection occurs. Okay? So this is only, again, another little rhetorical strategy. Oh, if the inventor of a theory goes off on it, if he decides it's not true, it can't be true, right? Please. You might as well believe Bill Gates in telling us that Windows is a good thing. Anyway, the story itself isn't true. James Moore, historian of science and religion, has shown that Lady Hope did indeed visit Darwin approximately 6 months before he died. And the story mentions Darwin lying on his deathbed. Darwin died in about a week and a half. Okay? He wasn't sitting around for 6 months, lying on a deathbed. So there's a hint of truth here, but it's not meaningful in any way. Despite this, creationists such as Malcolm Bowden seem to feel that James Moore actually proves that the story is true, which I guess proves that you get out of something what you want to get out of it. I want to give you a quote here from a tent evangelist by the name of James Fegan, who knew Darwin, who knew Lady Hope, and in fact was leading a tent revival in Down in Kent in 1881, when Darwin apparently was dying, although he didn't know it at the time. In the words of Bob Dylan, aren't we all dying? But anyway, okay. In his words, Fegan says, this is an illustration of the, quote, recklessness with which Protestant controversialists seek to support any cause they are advocating. And if you're going to take anything home from this morning's little talk, I think it's probably that quote. Okay, next big myth, Alfred Russel Wallace. Nice guy, got shafted by Darwin. Terrible. We should have a Wallace Day. Now, that ignores one central thing. The claim, of course, is that Wallace sent his letter to Darwin, his essay, which outlines his theory of natural selection. Darwin reads it. Darwin realizes, my God, I'm going to be scooped. I better A, change my theory. B, I have to get my theory out there. Charles Lyell, Joe Hooker, they all get together and say, what are we going to do? The cabal decides to essentially have the papers read together, the Linnaean Society in London. They never tell Wallace, and Darwin then rushes out and publishes The Origin of Species. And poor old Wallace is lying in, at the time, Indonesia, not having a clue what's going on. Well, it'd be wonderful if that indeed was true. But good hard evidence tells us that it isn't. And the reason is this. We know more about Darwin than we know about any other scientist, living or dead, quite frankly. Darwin was, how can I say, anal. He wrote down everything. We know what he ate on a given day, and this was because he had a number of mysterious sicknesses. We know what he ate. We know what he read. He kept notebooks. He kept diaries. The catalogue, and this is just a listing of whom he wrote letters to, is this thick. I've got a copy of up in my office. I use it when I need to do a little bit of weightlifting. Okay? We know more about Darwin. And in particular, what we have are three things. A set of notebooks written in 1838 to 39, where he first starts thinking about this, and two essays he writes. One in 1842, which he calls his sketch, and one in 1844, which he calls his essay. And in both of these, we see crystal clear the genesis of his theory of natural selection, if you pardon me mixing a metaphor there. So 20 years before Darwin receives this essay from Wallace, he's already got the theory there. Okay, and we get into the whole thing, well, why did he wait 20 years? Well, if you remember, I told you he's anal. And he wants to collect information, and more evidence, and more evidence, and more evidence. Okay. But it's clear that by the time he receives the essay from Wallace, he's already written the start of what he referred to as his big book on selection. And the big book had already got to 11 chapters, which came to about 250,000 words. It's a lot of words. Okay. And it's only by ignoring this priority that Darwin has, ignoring what we know, that you can say in any way that Darwin got his idea from Wallace. But equally as important, it also ignores the fact that Wallace's theory and Darwin's theory were very, very different. And I'm going to give you two easy ways, two short ways, and there are more. One is the idea that Darwin felt it was the individual who gets selected. That if something happened to the environment in this room, one or two of us might survive and the rest, well, become worm food. Whereas Wallace felt it was the group. So notionally, for example, he could say if the environment changes, all the humanists will survive. You see that? That idea of group selection. Which somebody's clapping, it might be a good thing. Okay. Loath for me to say the creationists survive or something like that. So one of them sees selection at the group level, and this, by the way, comes from Wallace's strong socialism. Wallace was a socialist as a very young man. He continued to be a socialist for most of his life. He also was a spiritualist, which actually leads us to the next difference. Wallace did not feel that natural selection could explain everything. And in particular, it couldn't explain the human mind. For the human mind to evolve, in Wallace's view, you needed to have some sort of divine controller. Darwin clearly felt that the mind, human thought, ethics, etc., evolved the same way as everything else. So there was a big difference for them. And while Wallace was, in fact, one of the prime spokesmen for Darwinism, he never himself was really a Darwinist. And that's an important point. Because what we're seeing here is a number of things. There were a lot of people after Darwin, after 1859, who called themselves Darwinists. Big D. But historical research has shown that very few of those individuals accepted the idea of natural selection or accepted the idea of gradual evolution. They were Darwinists in name only. And here I'm actually talking about biologists, not about the likes of Nietzsche and Marx and all that sort of stuff. What you have to remember is that Darwinists were always in the minority, up until around about the 1930s, when some bright sparks figured out how to join genetics with Darwinism, and we have what's known as the modern synthesis. So, although these individuals between 1859 and around about 1930 referred to themselves as Darwinists, they were essentially adopting they were evolutionists, yes, but not Darwinists. They were adopting Darwin's name. Darwin, if you want to think about it this way, became the patron saint of evolution, but not the patron saint of natural selection, as far as these individuals were concerned. And that's a very important distinction to get. Okay. The proceeding is in no way supposed to suggest that only anti-evolutionists get things wrong. As I said, Morris is an example of how this happens. Unfortunately, many non-creationists follow in the footsteps of Gertrude Himmelfarb, for example, and think that just because they don't like Darwinistic ideas, that Darwinism, evolutionism, and natural selection are all wrong as well. For example, well known is the preference of the likes of George Bernard Shaw, Samuel Butler, Arthur Kessler for the ideas of Lamarck. Lamarckism is a nice, fuzzy idea. It makes us feel good. If we all try really, really hard, we can make things better. Okay? And it's no surprise that at least Shaw and Butler had socialistic leanings. Other notable objectors include the likes of G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, Jan Smuts, Mortimer Adler. all very strong and well-known intellectuals. None of them biologists, none of them scientists. What they do share is a certain social conservatism. And for the longest time, anti-evolutionary, anti-Darwinian thinking and social conservatism went hand in hand for a very simple reason. The Darwinian view of the world is a world that is constantly changing. The status quo is only good in the immediate. It is not necessarily always good. Okay? And obviously social conservatism, in whatever manifestation we want to talk about, likes the world to stay as it is, or if it's going to change, to be controlled by some divine purpose. Now, an example of one of these individuals, and I'm picking her, I could pick many, is the critic Marilynne Robinson, who originally was the author of a best-selling coming-of-age novel, and now she's moved into a completely different field. I want you first to look at what Robinson defines Darwinism as. The interpretation of evolution which claims to refute religion and to imply a personal and social ethic which is, not coincidentally, antithetical to the assumptions imposed and authorized by Judeo-Christianity. There was I, all these years, in school, thinking Darwinism had something to do with biology. Wow, I guess my PhD's in theology. Excellent. So, okay, the premise is wrong starting off. We don't even have a correct idea of what Darwinism is. So in her whole essay, it should come as no surprise that Darwinism gets aligned with Nietzsche, Nazism, imperialism, eugenics, social Darwinism, scientific socialism in China and Cambodia, the latter two being definite red herrings, if you pardon the pun. No mention is made of the scientific evidence. In fact, she says, Darwinism is another faith, a loyalty to a vision of the nature of things despite its inaccessibility to demonstration. As I said earlier, 150 years of work in the field, in the laboratory, by geologists, biologists, biochemists, have shown us that A, evolution happens, and B, natural selection is a strong candidate for, if not the only, at least the best mechanism by which evolution occurs. Robinson, like all creationists, ignores this, particularly when they're talking about this whole sort of socialism thing. Not socialism, I mean socialism. They always have a lot to say about socialism. Okay? Now, I want to take another example which is equally as worrying, and I think this should worry you just a little bit. It's a book that's written by an Australian sociologist. At this point, I think all the Bruces in the room are supposed to stand up and do the Monty Python thing. But we didn't have the core cats.
That's right. No
yeah.
core cats.
Okay. Australian socialist John Carroll. The book was published in 1993, and it's called Humanism. Sounds like something you might want to think about reading. Wrong. Okay? Carroll is by no means a humanist, as we'll see. He opens his discussion of Darwin with claiming that Darwin's ideas were, quote, the greatest example of liberal vandalism. Biology replaces theology, and indeed it also replaces the humanities. It is one of the darkest episodes in the long and turbulent history of Western culture. I think you can figure out where this is going. Basically, he's not saying that Darwin is leading to a replacement of theology, for example. He's saying that it advocates it. Okay? Now, we have to remember, of course, that biology in particular and science in general cannot, by definition, tell us anything about the supernatural because of the mechanism that scientists use to study the world. The philosophical idea of naturalism. We can only use natural cause and effect, and by definition the supernatural is outside natural cause and effect, so, you know, if I'm a scientist and I say something about the supernatural, just fall asleep. I can say it as an individual, but not as a scientist. I can't wear my little funny white coat and a funny hat. That's all what we have to remember. Now, the idea that Darwin somehow replaces the humanities is facetious beyond belief. I've taught in humanities departments and programs. Believe me, there is no replacing going on there. If anything is replacing the humanities, it's French deconstructionism and postmodernism. And I'm not even going to get started. You're welcome. Okay, so what's Carroll's take on natural selection? What is natural selection? To Carroll, natural selection is it is that the strongest within a given environment survive. Weakness means extinction. If it is powerful, it is good. The new God, biology, recognizes only this one quality. It's like a little speech from Lord of the Rings, isn't it? It's hard to know where to start. Darwin's natural selection does not mandate anything about the strong, whatever that means, overcoming the weak, whatever that means. That whole strong versus weak idea comes from Ernst Haeckel, the German biologist and philosopher, who, by the way, though he called himself a Darwinian, big D, was actually a Darwinian, small d. He didn't accept common descent. That's a different thing. Okay? And I guess much of this confusion comes around the two things you would have on a t-shirt if you were a Darwinist. Survival of the fittest and struggle for existence. Those little phrases. And when I ask students, what is Darwinism? What is natural selection? Those that say survival of the fittest don't do very well in the class, or at least the initial portion of the class. Because that's a t-shirt slogan. And it leads to a lot of problems. And to understand what the problems are, we have to understand where the phrase survival of the fittest came from. It may surprise some people to know Darwin didn't actually come up with that phrase himself. Does anybody know who did?
Herbert Spencer.
Sorry?
Spencer. Herbert Spencer?
Spencer. Yes, indeed. Herbert Spencer, the British father of sociology, who I mentioned a little bit. And Spencer was big into these grand, universal, cosmic developmental plans. And he used the phrase survival of the fittest before Darwin actually published The Origin of Species. And Darwin himself doesn't use the phrase until 1871 in The Descent of Man. And then he uses it in subsequent editions of Origin. And he uses it for a very simple reason. Wallace. Wallace turned around to Darwin one day and said, look, we got a problem here. Well, that's probably not exactly what he said, but I'm paraphrasing. We got a problem here. This idea of natural selection. Now, I understand it's supposed to be analogous to artificial selection, plant and animal breeding. And I don't agree with that analogy, but even if we allow the analogy, even if we allow that, it kind of hints that there is a selector, right? That perhaps there is a divine being out there doing the selecting. Now, clearly, that was not an idea that Darwin wanted to hold. So he thinks about it and says, well, what can I say instead of natural selection? And Wallace says, what about survival of the fittest? And Darwin starts to use it. Okay? So the first thing we should get clear in our mind is that isn't exactly what Darwin initially intended to say. If anything encapsulates Darwinism, it's the phrase natural selection. And of course, the phrase itself, survival of the fittest, isn't a meaningless tautology, as some people claim. Firstly, a tautology by definition isn't meaningless. It's full of meaning. It just doesn't tell us anything we didn't already know. Okay? The standard argument states that who are the fittest? The fittest are those that survive, and just that natural selection is the survival of those that survive. And you will be surprised the amount of really smart and intelligent people who go through this argument. Okay. However, this is clearly not true. Within biological theory, the fittest are those that potentially can leave the greatest number of offspring. If I live to be 100, and I'm a monk, and assuming I'm a good monk, and don't have any children, I'm an evolutionary dead end, no matter how good my genes are. Okay? And note also that this introduces kind of like a statistical picture, or a statistical element into all of this. I could have the best genes in the universe, and modesty does not permit me to say I do. But if I walk out under a bus tomorrow, I'm dead. I'm an evolutionary dead end there as well. Assuming that, it wasn't because of my bad genes that I got hit by the bus. Okay? So the fittest are those that survive, because it all depends not only on how many offspring you have, but equally as important, how many offspring they have. If I have 100 offspring, I wouldn't get very much sleep. No, sorry. If I had 100 offspring, and let's imagine somehow, okay, my partner had a female gene which caused those offspring to become sterile. Okay, those offspring wouldn't have any offspring themselves. So my lineage is dead. Okay, so there's a lot more going on. The concept of fitness is a lot more subtle than most people take in. Anyway, so there's nothing here to do with power, strength, weak, all that sort of stuff. That's just, ignore it. Anyway, Carroll, like everybody else, is also worried about the possible effects of Darwinian thought on culture. He claims that such thought is, quote unquote, utterly dispiriting, and that it leads to the following. There is no place for free will. Not only is there no free will, there is no responsibility, no morality, only power. Any law is provisional, to be kept while it is useful, entirely relative to the moment of evolution. If such utility is the foundation of all law, men will soon stop obeying it, for one man's use is another man's nuisance. Everything can be disputed, for everything is relative. There are no absolutes. Well, that's it. I'm off to rob a liquor store. I mean, Darwin, in Carroll's view, is essentially, is forming the basis for modern relativism. And for Carroll, this is everything that's wrong with Western culture. Now, we can get into a debate about how relative modern culture is and whether it's a good or bad thing. But the issue clearly is, by anybody who wants to look at this in a relatively dispassionate manner, that Darwin has nothing to do with this. Every culture has always talked about, every generation has always talked about the younger generation as being more morally relative. It's what we do. We're humans, okay? At least I think we are. But here's one of my favorite quotes. Because basically, Carroll is making the claim that if man descended from lower animals, that implies that social instincts evolved, and therefore social instincts are relative. He tells us, the cultural consequences of Darwin were consciously that religion and honor are irrelevant. We should ignore them and continue on in the enlightened pursuit of comfort. Unconsciously, that the origin of origins is death and it rules. I don't know what that means. The origin of origins is death and it rules. Darwin cleared the cultural decks for the emergence of the demonic. The Darwinian view is refutable by example. Okay, so we're going to have an example that's going to refute Darwinism, so pay attention. Okay? That view would hold out that there is no essential difference between a group of men abducting a teenage girl, assaulting, raping, and murdering her, and a pack of wolves attacking a deer. Both acts are driven by violent instincts. Any self-respecting human community recognizes the two cases are fundamentally different. Yes, I agree with the latter. But does Carroll honestly think that Darwinism leads to rape? I'm not going to say too much more about that because I think it's fairly self-evident that we can do this in a number of ways. But I want to talk really quickly about Darwin and religion. Because even in his private writings, those things he didn't expect people to see outside of his family, he never claimed that religion was in any way irrelevant. In fact, whatever his religious beliefs, he started off as a Unitarian Christian, he ended up a professed agnostic. He respected the beliefs of others. For example, he refrained from discussing religion in his autobiography precisely because of his own wife's religious beliefs. She remained a believer. And we've already seen his aversion to getting his name attached to Edward Aveling's anti-Christianity. Okay? So we shouldn't hold Darwin up as being some sort of religious radical, like Carroll is doing. But we must also ask ourselves the question, does the idea that we may be descended from other animals diminish our existence in any way? Does it lead to a might is right mentality? Now, I'm going to answer no to both of those questions. Okay? Because I think they confuse the issue. They fall into what G.E. Moore called the naturalistic fallacy, which I'm sure many of you already know. Confusing the is with the ought. Looking out at the world and saying this is how things are, so this is how things should be. Which clearly is an idea that goes against any sort of political and social change. Even hardline advocates of the evolution of ethical standards do not claim that it's because we come from so-called lower animals that we should act like them. Okay? That's a parody. And it's a parody, I think, that humanists have been accused of in many forms. Okay? And clearly, I assume you don't hold it. Okay? It's precisely our ethical standards, however we got them, that differentiate ourselves from other organisms. And even if they evolved, which I suspect they did, okay, it does in no way leave us in a moral vacuum. Carroll seems to think it does. Okay? We as human beings do have free will, wherever it came from, and we are not totally driven by deterministic instincts, nor are we, for that matter, driven by divine mandate. Now, Carroll, we would just like to swat Carroll away and say he's just yet another gadfly, another crazy person who got tenure in some university and therefore shouldn't be trusted. Whoops, I slipped into that one, didn't I? Okay. But Carroll is described by another tenured individual as being, quote, truly original, challenging and conscience-stirring, a producer of sharp and uncompromising analyses, and having profound insight, intellectual irreverence, not intellectual irreverence, intellectual irreverence, and a sharp pen. As just this brief set of comments shows, Carroll's historical, or should I say hysterical analysis, is suspect. It's obvious that irreverence without factual accuracy is useless. And profundity and sharp compromising analyses require some basis in factual experience. Okay? Carroll is suffering from what has been termed Darwinitis, which is a medical condition, according to the AMA. It is the complaint which afflicts those of literary bent and with strong attachments to pre-scientific culture who find in the theory of evolution a disturbing and mysterious challenge to their values. And that's what it's really all about. Very few people, when you really talk to them, oppose Darwinian thinking because of any real evidence. There's always the metaphysical presupposition that comes beforehand, whether it's creationism, whether it's social conservatism, whether it's Judeo-Christian ethics, wherever it comes from. There's always that one thing. And the evidence is picked and chosen to bolster up that viewpoint. Now, truth be told, creationism of the Henry Morris kind is a spent force in American culture. The only reason we still know about it is there are very few people making an awful lot of noise. And I mean an awful lot of noise. The hysteria of the likes of Robinson and Carroll was more a product of the Reagan-Bush years. And it seems to be on the decline, although I may be wrong. I'm talking about the elder Bush, of course. However, there's now a new movement which seems to suffer from Darwinitis. And this is what's known as intelligent design theory, as they like to call themselves. Most philosophers of science and historians of science refer to it as intelligent design creationism. They don't like that word because it's got the C word in it, creationist. Okay? It's not quite one of George Carlin's 7 words, but you're not allowed to say it if you're going to be taken seriously. IDT, Intelligent Design Theory, or IDC, Intelligent Design Creationism, is essentially spearheaded by a group in Seattle, Washington, the Discovery Institute. And those of you who don't know would be happy to hear that the Discovery Institute is in fact a conservative think tank, interested in such issues as law, defense spending, and all that sort of stuff. But what they seek to do, and don't worry, I'm nearly finished, what they seek to do is remove one of the boundary conditions for scientific inquiry. The fact that scientists have to use natural law to explain things. That's called methodological naturalism. And it has to be distinguished from what's known as philosophical naturalism, the idea that nature is all that there is. Now, many people in this room might indeed be philosophical naturalists, okay? But it is a philosophical position. Okay? It's not a scientific position, okay? Because scientists have to use methodological naturalism, natural law, supernatural lies outside natural law, etc., etc. So what this movement wants to do is inject theism into the scientific procedure to allow you to turn around and say, well, we can't explain it using natural law, so God did it. Okay? Now, clearly that falls into the whole, has the danger of falling into the whole God of the gaps fallacy. Okay? And, quote, what they want to do is, the movement promises to reverse the stifling dominance of the materialist worldview and to replace it with a science consonant with Christian and theistic convictions. This is new flavor creationism. It's not your granddad's creationism. Okay? It's prettied up, okay, if you want it. And this is the movement that's so vocal in trying to have design theory being taught in schools. And only last month, bills seeking to have design theory taught were introduced in Washington and Idaho, and there are a number more on the way. Okay? And even the briefest examination of the writings of this group show us that they see Darwinism which they equate with materialism, as being the prime thing that has caused the decline of Judeo-Christian culture. I've got an extended quote, which I'm just going to throw out at you. The proposition that human beings are created in the image of God is one of the bedrock principles on which Western civilization was built. Its influence can be detected in most, if not all, of the West's greatest achievements, including representative democracy, human rights, free enterprise, and progress in the arts and sciences. Claim number one. Yet over a century ago, this cardinal idea came under wholesale attack by intellectuals, drawing on the discoveries of modern science. Debunking the traditional conceptions of both God and man, thinkers such as Charles Darwin portrayed humans not as moral or spiritual beings, but as animals or machines who inhabited a universe ruled by purely impersonal forces, and whose behavior and very thoughts were dictated by the unbending force of biology, chemistry, and the environment. This materialistic conception of reality eventually infected virtually every area of our culture, from politics and economics to literature and art. The cultural consequences of this triumph of materialism were devastating. Materialists denied the existence of objective moral standards, claiming that environment dictates our behavior and beliefs. They also undermined personal responsibility by asserting that human thoughts and behaviors are dictated by our biology and environment. The results can be seen in modern approaches to criminal justice, product liability, and welfare. In the materialist scheme of things, everyone is a victim, and no one can be held accountable for his or her actions. I'm sure that's what was going through Darwin's mind when he was writing product liability. Maybe his pen stopped working. There is plenty more of that, and I'm not going to go through it. What's clear here is that the adoption of anything called intelligent design is but the thin end of a wedge. First the science classes, then the humanities, the arts, legal studies, etc. They'll all be infused with this theistic alternative. It's worrying that the advocates of such an overhaul are themselves conservative Christians and are likely to receive some support from the present federal administration. Indeed, Republican lawmakers last year hosted design advocates in Washington. Now, I don't have enough time to keep on going talking about intelligent design theory, and perhaps if I haven't bored you rigid, I can come back at some stage and talk about that. But it's clear that Darwinism is again being held responsible for much that ails American society. And that alone is the real myth of Darwinism. Thank you.
I just would like to point out that there is going to be an intelligent design speaker on the ASU campus. I'll have to get the details and I'll email it. I think it's February 21st, but I don't know what building. And the students are, the Christian students are sponsoring this. I tried to talk with our ASU free thought group to see if they can persuade them perhaps to make this into a debate. Would you be willing to be the opponent? Thought I put you on the spot. I don't know if he's going to give up his platform. So
I'd have to know who it is before I'd commit myself.
Yeah.
I was telling Bruce about this on the way in. Bruce was kind enough to give me a lift. I had the pleasure of debating Dwayne Gish when I was a grad student in Ireland. I didn't know what I was letting myself in for. I consequently now do. But the thing about it was that there's an expression, I don't know if any of you fly fish. There's a type of fly, a tie fly, called a greased weasel. Dwayne Gish is a greased weasel. And the problem is a large number of the intelligent design debaters, and I use the word very euphemistically, are greased weasels. And I've had my share of weasel greasing for a while. But let me know who it is, and I'll see if I can find out.
The name is on the site. I'll find out. I don't know if he's even willing to do that.
Probably not. They don't like being broadsided like that, much the same way as evolutionists don't like being
But we
broadsided.
should pack the audience.
Chris.
Was the public television biography on Darwin anywhere close to your approval?
Right,
Saw
that's the PBS Evolution series,
Right.
first episode. Actually, one of the researchers I mentioned, Jim Moore, was involved with researching it and helping them. He's written probably what is the best biography of Darwin, which is called Darwin, Portrait of a Tortured Evolutionist. It's a beautiful title, with Adrian Desmond. So he knows what he's talking about. The book's about yay thick, well worth reading. It's very, very readable. But there were places, personally I was like, well, I wouldn't have done it like that. There were places where they had, for example, his brother Erasmus, who was named after his grandfather. His brother Raz having these conversations. He was like an amanuensis for him. He was like channeling the ideas out of Darwin. It didn't happen like that.
Right.
Strangely enough, Raz Darwin was spending most of his time high on opium. And so he wasn't really in a position to do very much. But the large-scale structure was the same. Now, what's interesting is the Discovery Institute had launched a website that attacked the PBS Evolution series. And in so doing, one of the things they started picking at was the historical accuracy of all of this. And if you go to the National Centre of Science Education website, Eugenie Scott's group, what you'll see is actually Jim Moore actually replied to their call for inaccuracies, and he really put them in their position. So yes, it was historically accurate, but it compressed things, it moved things around. But the general way, the theory came out is more or less. And also Darwin's worrying about, for example, the issue of the death of his daughter. I mean, one of the real reasons Darwin gave up, as Jim Moore says, gave up Christianity, was that his 10-year-old daughter died, Annie. And there's a new book out about it called Annie's Box, Darwin, Human Evolution, Darwin, His Daughter, and Human Evolution, which is well worth reading. But the argument was that, Darwin saw this child, this 10-year-old child, as pure, innocent, as being, the greatest thing, sweetest child. And she died horribly, and she died at the age of 10. And whereas his theory was leading him at the time to believe, well, there wasn't probably a personal God, this killed it off completely. And he was never, however, in the position that he could say, well, I definitely know that there's no God. He was stuck in the position, I know there is no personal God. So he became an agnostic. And of course, as many of you probably know, agnosticism is the word that Thomas Henry Huxley invented for his own beliefs.
You said
Sorry.
something that Darwin said something about animals and machines. What is, could you briefly say something about the mechanistic conception of life, good or bad, simple enough?
Well, firstly, it was Carroll saying that Darwin said something about animals being machines. I don't think Darwin himself, even in his notebooks, never used precisely that sort of equation. Mechanistic conception of life, yes. As a scientist, I say yes. As a non-scientist, I still say yes. I have to wear two hats. I have to move them around. I think one of the things that argues for a mechanistic conception of life is the sheer ability of naturalism and mechanistic thought to explain things. It is almost perverse to adopt the status, the idea that some of the intelligent design theorists do, that, well, we can't explain the human mind, so God must have done it. Because where you fall into is that problem. If you suddenly turn out to explain the human mind, where does God go? Well, we have to find another mystery for him. So the provisional hypothesis, at least for me personally, as a scientist and as a non-scientist, is that we assume mechanism. And you know what? I'm kind of perverse as well. I don't actually think the human mind is that good. I think it's horribly flawed in both the way it does things and its whole design principle. And, if it was designed by somebody, he probably works for Microsoft. Cha-ching! That's twice. Yes, sir.
What is the difference, if any, between the theory of evolution and the theory of natural selection?
Okay. Did everybody get that? What's the difference between the theory of evolution and the theory of natural selection, if any? Let's first go to Michael Roos's three uses of the word evolution. The fact that we see things change in the geological and in the fossil record, and also in real time. The fact, then there's the path of it, and then there's the mechanism you use to explain it. Now, the word theory is used by scientists to talk about a group of hypotheses that have been shown to be true that have good explanatory value. So the theory of evolution is, if you want to think about it, not a theory in the popular sense of the word. It is the first two things that Michael Roos was talking about. the observation, and the path. Okay? The theory of natural selection is then used to explain the previous two. You see my point? So, if we disprove natural selection tomorrow, we're still left with the theory of evolution. Okay? How do we disprove the theory of evolution? Well, and creationists often turn around and say, well, you know, this evolution thing, it's kind of tricky because you can never disprove it, right? It never makes testable hypotheses or predictions. Well, it does. I'm sure 2 weeks from now you're going to have Don Johanson in here. Definitely come. He's a great speaker. He's a good person. But Don would immediately disprove the theory of evolution if he went 3.5 million years ago and found a complete modern human skeleton. Or even a part of a modern human skeleton. We're not going to be too picky about this. Right? So, or if around about the Precambrian, the famous Cambrian explosion, okay, that you found modern humans or even modern type animals, that would disprove evolution in one fell swoop. Now, somebody then usually turns around and goes, well, you know, they found it, but they're not showing anybody. Well, you see, here's the thing. What is the quickest way to make your name as a scientist? Don Johanson did it. Don Johanson found Lucy. Okay? It's actually the quickest way to become a well-known scientist is disprove an old scientist. And so if I suddenly find it tomorrow, that's my name, mate, right? I could be touring the country writing books for the rest of my life. And scientists are egotists. That's the most important thing. We like to see our name printed. So, you know, it's provable, it's disprovable, which is important than it being provable. But the whole thing is the theory of evolution stands independent of the explanation that is natural selection. I think somebody, Susan, do you want to moderate? And just, oh, gee, thanks. Okay, we'll run around this way. It's probably the easiest way. Yes, sir.
I found it very interesting to learn that Charles Darwin is buried in the Westminster Abbey beside Isaac Newton. Now, why is that?
Okay. Yes, a lot of people find that very, very amusing, I suppose, that you can go to Westminster Abbey. And I made my little pilgrimage there. Because that's really what it is when you think about it. Okay, he's dead, you know, but you're standing where he was. He originally was going to be buried in Down. His family had arranged for it. They had a coffin made. They were ready to go. Thomas Henry Huxley, his bulldog, for want of a better expression, and a number of the major scientific players at the time got it passed through the House of Commons and Lords that Darwin, because he was such an eminent scientist, would be buried in Scientist's Corner. So there was a full state funeral. There was a special, I want to say chant, but that's not what I'm looking for. There was a special anthem made for it. But what's kind of interesting is that nobody goes there. Because of the way Westminster Abbey, if you ever find yourselves there, and it's an amazing building, I mean, you know, whether you believe or not, but if you go there, you're kind of herded around. There's one way around. And you start off, and you know, you see all the queens and kings, and me being a good Irishman, I don't spend too much time there. And we keep on going. And you come around, you pass Poets' Corner, where most people forget most of the poets aren't actually buried, it's just little plaques. And you come to the tomb of the unknown soldier. And most people at that point go, because the exit is there, most people go, okay, that's it, I'm out. Keep on going, wrap around. You'll find yourself walking over the grave, if you'd like to do that sort of thing, of Darwin, of Charles Lyell. Newton's got this huge thing as well. Okay? And it's really quite, if you think about it, even if you don't believe in the afterlife or anything, it's kind of a special place, particularly if you study Victorian science, because they're all here, or they're all there, or at least their names are. Okay? But it all came out of actually a political act. And Emma Darwin, his wife, didn't really want that to go ahead. And Huxley and Hooker persuaded her that it was the thing to do, that he had to be recognized. So yeah, you have an agnostic being buried in Westminster Abbey, but let's be honest, it's not the first time it's happened. Yes, sir?
Going back to his question, could you say a few words about Lamarckian processes, and are there any other models for evolutionary processes besides natural selection and the Lamarckian model?
Okay. Normally people have to pay for this. This is like Bio 101 or something like that. It's okay. It's okay.
If you're operating.
Lamarck, crazy French guy. At least that's what the English thought anyway. came to the idea of what was known as something, it was actually something that was accepted by a large number of people, including the ancient Greeks. The idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. For example, blacksmiths' sons have big arms, okay, because they're working out and all that sort of thing. That anything you do in this life will be passed on to your offspring. Okay. Now, that seemed to make sense, but there's no mechanism for it. Okay. There's only one place where there is a mechanism for some sort of inheritance of acquired characteristics, and that's actually in the immune system. If you think about it, your body is exposed to a large number of pathogens in any given day. Okay? And that the question is, how does the limited genetic variability that the immune system have allow it to take care of a lot of these sort of things? And one of the working models is that it's somehow Lamarckian. Okay? Now, there were a lot of people who accepted Lamarckism. The famous case, of course, was Paul Kammerer, who was called the case of the midwife toad. And what he actually did was forge his results. And he eventually climbed up a mountain in Switzerland and blew his brains out. So there's no, to this day, any real scientific evidence for that. So if we're talking about speciation, Lamarckism is out. We've got natural selection. We've also got things like genetic drift. Okay, that mutations happen which are selectively, neutral, and they will build up over time. We've got things like geographic speciation. The idea that just, if a mountain suddenly appears right in the middle of this room, you may want to either go left or right, I don't know. But if a mountain suddenly appears, the group on this side wouldn't be able to breed with the group on this side. Reproductive isolation. There's nothing to do with natural selection in there, right? It's just pure luck whether you end up with this crowd who obviously think they're better looking and better, or this crowd who think they're better looking and better. Okay. So you've got genetic drift. There's a large number of other mechanisms. Here's the important thing. Darwin was a pluralist. He didn't see natural selection as doing everything. He lapsed into Lamarckianism as he got older because of critiques he got from guys like St. George Jackson Mivart and a couple of other people, the Duke of Argyll, for example. And so Darwin had this sort of pluralistic attempt. Now, classic neo-Darwinism, the sort of thing that's espoused by, say, Ernst Mayr or E.O. Wilson and stuff like that, tends not to be so pluralistic. But most practicing biologists realize that natural selection may perhaps be able to do everything that we think it does, but we still can't prove it can do everything we think it does. But if there is another mechanism, it is naturalistic. We don't have to look for the hand of God in it. Okay. Start back there. Yes, sir.
How does Darwin, natural selection, and evolution fly in Ireland?
It flies quite well. It flies like an Aer Lingus jumbo jet. I'm going to have to keep that line. That's quite good. This is the strange thing. I mean, Ireland, as you probably know, is nominally 98% Catholic. And I remember being taught evolution in school. My first exposure to creationism actually came from my old mentor when I was doing my PhD. He gave me a copy of a book about American creationism. And I thought it was some kind of sick joke. I read this and I'm going,
It is.
well, yeah. But no, I mean, really sick joke. Like he was trying to do something to my mind or something like that. Evolution is taught in schools. It's taught in biology class. Religion isn't taught in biology class. Religion is taught in the public schools in Ireland, by the way. It's mandatory. It's hell on earth, but you have to do it. Okay? Reading the Gospels, all that sort of stuff. So there's no confusion there. And I think that comes from essentially the Catholic way of looking at things. Because since more or less the 1950s, Pope Pius XII wrote essentially, well, we have to accept some of this because, let's face it, we got burnt by Galileo rather than Galileo getting burnt by us. And then, of course, with the current Pope, with his proclamation, which may be a little bit wishy-washy, but is actually very like what Wallace himself believed, as an example, that Catholicism in general, even in this country, is far more liberal as far as teaching evolution is concerned. In fact, I can only think of one Catholic creationist, one of the major creationists that's Catholic, that's Michael Behe, who wrote Darwin's Black Box. And of course, up against him, you have Kenneth Miller, who's Catholic and clearly a Darwinist. So in Ireland, Yeah, it's like the joke you tell about your strange American cousins. And it was kind of funny because even when I came over here, I've been here for 8 years teaching at ASU. When I came over, I thought, well, you know, that was only the book. That's only in the deep south. You know, and I was hearing sort of deliverance music in the back of my head. And I walked into one of my early classes and I was talking about the evolution of fish and realized these biology majors, A, know nothing about evolution, B, know nothing about fish, Darwinian or otherwise, and C, some of them are creationists. And I decided I had to do something about it, so I ended up teaching the sort of stuff that I did. Yes, sir?
I think the Pope even recently said that creationism couldn't be sustained or upheld with scientific theory. So even some of the Catholics in Ireland may need to listen to the Pope. But at your level of teaching, are you controlled by creationists either in the form of legislation, the courts, politically correct?
No. And the reason it comes, I mean, there is this thing called academic freedom. And a large number of creationists use academic freedom to mean the student should get to choose what the student hears. When in fact the definition of academic freedom is that the teacher gets to choose what the teacher wants to teach. Although ASU is a public institution, we're not controlled by any form of school board as to what we teach. I mean, it leads to, say, for example, Peter Lehman in the humanities department doing his class on pornography. I used to be in the humanities department. It is a den of iniquity. It is, trust me. No, but the thing about it is we've got total control. Where it became interesting, actually, with I was telling a couple of people earlier, with Don Johansson, because when they tried to move the institute here, the Board of Regents, one person in particular in the Board of Regents, suggested that alternative theories of evolution should be taught. And Wendy Wilkins, who was the assistant dean at the time, knew that I was interested in history of biology and creationism. And she asked me could I develop a course that taught alternative theories. And I went, well, I can teach alternative theories, but not quite in the way that the Board of Regents would want. And she essentially said it doesn't make a difference, they're not going to turn up in the class anyway. So I teach this class every couple of years where I teach young earth creationism, intelligent design theory, evolution, critical thinking. I think I worried Susan just a little bit for a second. She thought, you must be teaching them critical thinking, aren't you? So yeah, I mean, and you teach them how to analyze this stuff. And by the end of the class, even the hardcore fundamentalists come away with going, yeah, we can talk about faith, which is essentially the Pope's position. It was Aquinas' position. We can talk about faith, we can accept something on faith, but we shouldn't use science to prove something in a way that we can't do. And that, to me, is the message of this whole creationism thing. Yep.
If you appreciate the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix and would like to see more, then subscribe to our channel and check us out on Patreon. Links are in the description.